October 12, 1944, 6:11 a.m., Adirondack Mountains, New York. A51 on a routine weather hop slips into low cloud above 5 ponds and vanishes from the radio. Why now? Because 60 years later, in October 2004, that same silence begins to move. The question is blunt and unbearable. What happened to Lieutenant Michael McCarter between takeoff and nothing? The flight plan is straight, the map of grief is not. Something old has shifted in those trees, and someone notices. The forest kept a receipt, and someone wants it burned. Captain Ethan Carter understood how missing turns into paper. At 34, he was the Defense Department's liaison for unrecovered service members, the person who answered when the past dialed the present and demanded a witness. Most tips collapsed under their own wishfulness. A barroom sighting, a scrap that belonged to another decade, a date off by 2 wars. This call felt different before he even picked up. U.S. Forest Service. Harrisville Ranger Station. Naomi Yazzie on the line, voice steady, coordinates already waiting. He wrote the numbers and watched them land on the western Adirondacks, where everything is a stubborn quilt of water and stone. His grandfather had vanished over this country on a morning that should have been procedural: climb, cross, return, ferry east when cleared. Family lore called it weather. The telegram called it presumed. His grandmother called it something else and then kept the rest for herself. Ethan grew up beneath a folded flag and a photograph of a young pilot whose gaze never quite forgave the sky. They met at the 5 Ponds trailhead just after dawn, when fog pinned the spruce and the air tasted of iron and rain. Naomi was shorter than her voice, boots scuffed, ponytail tucked beneath a cap that had seen seasons. A state trooper in a windbreaker took names for a log that would sit on a shelf until someone needed it to mean something. A volunteer SR crew checked radios with the ritual calm of people who understand how quickly ordinary can end. Naomi offered him a thermos. "Coffee before truth," she said, and he held the heat like a promise. The trail narrowed to a breath and then a whisper. Roots slicked underfoot. Water moved without asking. Naomi read the ground like a book she'd memorized: broken fern, a scuff on bark, a slope that promised trouble if a pilot came in low. Ethan kept his eyes level, counting steps, letting rhythm hold panic in its lane. The first wrongness was only a curve where curves shouldn't be, a buried line persuading the leaf litter to lie differently. Naomi stopped and didn't speak for a heartbeat too long. Then she pointed. Not a monument. Not a wing stabbing the sky. The forest had pulled what it could inward with patience and moss. Ethan brushed aside needles with a gloved hand, and dull aluminum blinked like an old coin. The tail number found him before he found it. Naomi exhaled, a small sound that meant confirmation and condolence at once. They worked by the book. Photographs. Pinned flags to mark angles. Notes written with fingers that wanted to shake. No ripping, no rushing, no triumph over what time had already decided. The quiet pressed close enough to hear your own blood. Inside the canopy, a leather wallet waited where a hand might have rested without thinking. A thin photograph had fused to the plastic window. A woman in a dress that knew September. Next to it, tucked beneath a folded rib of metal as if placed, not thrown, a sealed envelope sat perfect and wrong. The paper was waxed against time, edges clean, corners square. The stamp across its face didn't shout. It instructed, eyes only. Naomi's glance found Ethan's and held. Some words turn conversations into records. Some records turn families into plaintiffs. They radioed it in. Authority, when summoned, moves at 2 speeds, hush and siren. A state evidence kit opened like a ceremony. Caution tape blinked against green. The trooper took custody with careful hands. Naomi logged the time, latitude, and weather as if the sky itself might be called to testify. Ethan signed where he was told to sign, and the ache in his chest took on a box number. His phone buzzed. He didn't want to look. He looked. Stuffed. Secure nothing further. We'll take it from here. A friend. The text wore the right clothes, minimal, imprecise, practiced. It knew the color of his fear. Naomi saw his face and didn't ask. You okay? He nodded because there wasn't a word for this. Later, in a federal building with a flag in the corner and plastic plants doing their best, he would request his grandfather's file from the archives and receive weather of another kind, a stamped form that turned the air thick. Historical review, restricted. He pressed his thumb to the ink as if skin could learn what paper refused to say. Outside, rain stitched the parking lot into small mirrors. Ethan sat in his car and wrote 3 sentences he could survive. The wreck is real. The envelope exists. Somebody else already knew. He closed the notebook and listened to the wipers count seconds like a metronome you can't argue with. The next move would decide whether truth grew legs or found a drawer. Someone rewrote his last flight, and the file knows why. They brought the envelope back to the Harrisville Ranger Station like it might decide to breathe if anyone startled it. Chain of custody forms multiplied. A plastic evidence tub appeared, labeled, time-stamped, placed on a table that had seen more maps than miracles. Naomi Yazzie set an overhead camera humming. The state trooper read a script that turned touch into procedure. Captain Ethan Carter called 2 people before the seal was even photographed. Colonel Avery Ross at Air Force Historical Research and Dr. Lila Monroe at the National Archives. Ross answered on the first ring, voice clipped, the sound of someone who sleeps next to a go bag. Lila called back 2 minutes later, desk lamp clicking on, her breath sounding like paper turning. Ethan gave them the tail number, the coordinates, the stamp on the envelope. Ross didn't pause. Secure the site. Do not open. An interagency team is en route. Lila didn't match his certainty. Captain, your grandfather's file shows a sealed annex entered in 1967. It's flagged historical review, restricted. I've never seen the annex itself. She stopped, the sort of silence that can teach a room to listen. Keep everything sterile. Document everything. And don't be alone. The text buzzed again on Ethan's phone. Same number as before, same tone of practiced ownership. So, secure nothing further. We'll take it from here. A friend. He put the device face down and met Naomi's eyes. We do this by the book, she said. Not their book. The book. The trooper nodded and shifted the evidence tub into the camera's frame like he was introducing a witness. Gloves. Scalpels. A scale card. Nothing hurried. No breath wasted. Naomi slit the wax cleanly along the fold. The paper yielded with a sound that belonged in another decade. Inside lay 3 items that turned a missing aircraft into an accusation. A typewritten briefing on onion skin. Operation Wren. Ultra-secret printed in a font that always looks like it's hiding something. A hand-drawn map with pencil hills and corrected bearings, the words Extraction Point Alpha stitched into the page just east of 5 Ponds. And a list of names with home addresses the way the 1940s liked to write them, lines that started with rank and ended with cities that still exist. No one spoke for a count of 5. The trooper read each line into the camera, steady, emotionless, the way you name the dead when it matters that you get it right. Ethan stared at the heading. Primary objective, escort transfer of intelligence personnel to secure federal custody pending debrief. Secondary objective, maintain deniability of transit route. Flight plan modifications authorized to avoid civil observation. A paragraph further down carried a sentence that placed cold fingers on the back of his neck. Volunteer pilot aware of asset risk. Contingency protocols. Expendable. The words sat on the page as if it had always existed and nothing could be done about it. The map was ugly and honest. It pulled a thin line off the intended ferry route and looped it down into a corridor of water and woods only locals used. The extraction point wasn't a runway or a road. It was a fire lane cut through spruce to a shuttered forestry shed that once stored pumps and rations. Naomi traced the pencil arrow with her gloved finger. You could land a small thing there, she said quietly. You could also disappear carrying something you were never supposed to carry. Ethan scanned the list of names. Army Signal Corps. Naval Code Office. An RAF liaison with a Boston address. The 4th name made his throat close. Franklin Hale, Newark, New Jersey. He didn't know why it struck like a match until memory caught up. A box in his grandmother's attic. A letter from 1949, folded and brittle, signed F. Hale. I knew your husband was on our side even when our own didn't look like it. He had never been able to place the name. The room leaned closer without moving. Lila's voice over speaker softened. "Captain, if that's the Franklin Hale I think it is, there are oral histories at the Library of Congress that mention him. He'd be very old now." Colonel Ross broke back in, firmer, colder. "You will reseal those documents immediately and await federal custody. Do not disseminate. Do not copy. This is not optional." Something in his tone felt less like authority and more like habit. Naomi clicked the camera timecode and looked at Ethan. The overhead lens saw the paperwork and not the calculation passing between them. He held the briefing at the corner, careful, and read a line out loud for the record. "Maintain deniability of transit route." He looked up. They chose Wilderness because Wilderness doesn't testify. The trooper's pen scratched. The clock on the wall said late morning, but the case had slipped to a different hour. Ethan cataloged the envelope contents, then stepped into the hallway, where a corkboard held flyers about invasive plants and a lost dog with one blue eye. He called Lila back. "If we don't move forward, this dies on a shelf," he said. Lila didn't argue. "I can pull the accession logs for 1967. If there was a sealed annex added then, someone signed for it. A name is a hinge. Hinges open things." When he returned, Naomi had placed the map beneath a clear sleeve and laid a USS topo beside it. Pencil met contour. The coordinates from the wreck matched the penciled alpha within 100 yards. That kind of accuracy is either luck or a plan. The camera kept blinking. Outside, trucks arrived that did not belong to the forest. Men in suits who didn't look at the trees stood by a vehicle that idled like a thought you can't dismiss. Ethan felt the moment collect itself. He didn't ask permission to believe what the evidence suggested. He asked for the next point on the line. One of the names on that list wasn't just history, it was still reachable. They returned to the crash site under a sky that couldn't make up its mind. Sun pressed through in thin coins, then slipped away, leaving the woods to their damp arithmetic. Naomi Yazzie carried the topo map inside a plastic sleeve. Ethan Carter brought a kit that looked like it should contain medicine but really held calipers, protractors, and a patience he didn't trust yet. The state trooper waited by the tape with a radio clipped high on his shoulder, eyes moving like a metronome over tree line, creek, tree line. The forest didn't care who was in charge. The air around the wreck smelled faintly of wet tin. On their first pass, they had honored the rules. Photograph, tag, record, withdraw. Now came the part no one advertises. Ethan crouched by the port side and placed a transparent grid over a run of punctures that marched from fuselage to canopy frame. The edges were clean, the tiers turned inward, the kind of damage you don't get from a head-on dogfight. He measured angle of entry and wrote the numbers on a whiteboard that didn't look like it belonged in a forest. Naomi watched where he watched, then stepped back and sighted along a line he hadn't drawn yet. "From below," she said. "And behind." Somebody shot up. Not down. He adjusted the grid a fraction. 50 to 60 yards if the shooter stood at the base of that rise, he murmured. Naomi tracked the slope to a runnel of stone and water the color of tea. Even after 60 years, the ground kept the shape of force. She found a scatter of rusted fragments under moss, too small to be anything, too deliberate to be nothing, and flagged them. No shell casings. No footprints saved by miracle. Only geometry in metal and an older story underneath. Ethan slid into the cockpit cavity the way you would enter a room that still remembers voices. The seat frame had buckled hard. The instrument panel had shed glass like scales. Where the radio stack should have been, the bracket was empty and bright from a human hand long ago. He felt for what the eye couldn't find and tapped a bulkhead rib. Hollow. He unspooled a fiberscope and fed it through a crease in the skin. The monitor showed shadow, then cloth, then a rectangle that caught light the way waxed paper does. He worked a slim tool along the seam and eased out an oilcloth packet tied with cord that had turned the color of swamp roots. When Naomi lifted the flap, a compact transmitter bid the year's good morning. Smaller than 1944 should allow all edges and intention. The trooper leaned close, careful not to cross the line. "That's standard." "Not for a routine hop," Ethan said. He photographed the set, the cords, the quick code will still tape to the lid, then logged the coordinates for a thing that never planned to be found. He felt the old training click in. Transmit on low power. Short bursts. Prearranged windows. Nothing a weather fairy needed or carried. Naomi held his gaze and he understood she was building the same bridge he was. Wilderness was a route, not a mistake. Back at the ranger station, they laid the hand-drawn map beside the USGS grid. Pencil roads met real ones. Waterways matched like veins under the skin. Extraction Point Alpha sat where the fire lane met a shuttered forestry shed marked Pump House 12 on a 1942 survey Naomi hauled from a basement drawer that smelled like dust and ambition. A dotted spur line told a story about temporary access the public never used. You could move a truck in at night and no one would see it, she said. You could move a person out and no one would ask. Ethan called Dr. Lila Monroe on speaker. She had inhabited the Library of Congress catalog by lunch. There's a series of WPA-era journals from Adirondack woodsmen, she said, tapping keys we could hear without seeing. St. Lawrence County, 1944, a timberman named Otis Carr writes about strange patrols speaking English and another language that sounded clipped, near Oswegatchie. He notes a crash, like a train fell out of the sky, and the next day men walking the river like they were counting it. He doesn't mention recovery. She let the last sentence sit where it hurt. And I found an index for oral histories of a Franklin Hale. The synopsis says Signal Corps, East Coast Detention Site, post-capture interrogations, suspected leak in frequency assignments. The name was more than a note from an attic now, it was a door with a key. Ethan's pulse found a higher gear. Is Hale alive? If it's the same man, there's a Newark address updated 3 years ago, Lila said. Age would put him mid-90s. Telephone listed. I can't confirm beyond that without a request. A knock sounded at the ranger station door. Not a knock, exactly. The way knuckles sound when they assume the room belongs to them. 2 men in suits held credentials Ethan didn't know and didn't need to know to understand. The trooper checked IDs, made a call that died in his own pocket, and stepped aside the way a river does when a large rock insists. The shorter suit smiled like the end of a conversation. We'll take all federal material into custody now. Naomi didn't return the smile. We haven't finished documenting. That won't be necessary. The words were clean, their edges too bright. Ethan glanced at the evidence tub, at the radio, at the map with pencil breath still on it. Lila's voice whispered through the speaker, almost superstitious. Captain, sometimes the only way to keep a thing is to let it leave through more than one door. He took a single photograph that wasn't in any manual, the suits reflected in the plastic sleeve covering the map, their faces warped by topography the way truth bends over terrain. Then he stepped into the hallway and dialed the Newark number Lila had given him, pulse in his ears, the line ringing into a room he needed to exist. An old man answered on the 3rd ring and said Ethan's last name before he gave his own. I was there, Franklin Hale said, and I know why your grandfather never came home. Franklin Hale lived on the 2nd floor of a red brick walk-up in Newark where the hallway smelled like old polish and hot dust. He opened the door before Ethan Carter could knock twice. A lean man in his mid-90s wearing a pressed shirt and a look that had practiced waiting. You've got his eyes, he said. And for a second Ethan wasn't an officer with a case. He was a grandson who had carried a folded flag for most of his life. Naomi Yazzie took a quiet step back, letting the room decide its scale. Dr. Lila Monroe joined by speaker from D.C., her voice a steady wire on the table between an ashtray and a stack of library slips. Frank walked without a cane. He poured tea like a ritual and set a small leather folder in front of Ethan, the kind of thing that belongs in a desk drawer but has lived on the body instead. I was Signal Corps, he said. East Coast postings. Summer of '44, we found an anomaly in our own house. Frequencies we changed kept showing up on the wrong side. Not all of them. Enough to make a pattern. I reported it. They moved me to a holding site in the Adirondacks for evaluation. You don't lock a man up for being wrong. He smiled without humor. They lock you up because you're right too soon. He slid out a thin page with wavering script. Ethan recognized the hand from the oilcloth packet. Michael Carter had written in a cramped, deliberate line meant to be read by people who would never meet him. Magpie compromised, the note said. Frequencies exposed. If I don't make it, audit all missions authorized via Magpie channel. Frank tapped the name. Magpie wasn't a rumor. It was a person with a desk, a stamp, and the confidence of people who never got mud on their boots. Major Thomas Keene. Later Colonel. After the war, liaison. The kind of job that means you sit in rooms where maps do what you say. Ethan felt the hallway in his chest narrow. How do you know Keene was Magpie? Frank lifted another paper, this one a carbon copy on onion skin that had survived by stubbornness and luck. Transfer authorization bearing Keene's signature for our movement from the holding site to a federal facility that shouldn't have needed us unless they planned to ask the same question over and over until it broke. He placed a photograph next to it, a group of men on a dirt road, an army truck half out of frame, a face in the background with the kind of self-possession that doesn't learn, it assumes. He came to inspect security. 2 days later, the frequency we had quarantined showed up again in traffic that wasn't ours. Naomi took notes, not to own the story but to keep it from dissolving. Lila's voice threaded through. If Keene is Magpie, his authorizations would appear across multiple agencies. The annex from 1967 could be part of a cleanup. A file that explains the delay as procedure and buries people under words like deception and necessary. Frank nodded once. When Carter went down, we heard the crash from the barracks. We had a plan, small, desperate, stubborn. He reached us. He carried a transmitter I'd only seen in sketches. He told me what the map already knew. Adirondack wasn't an accident. It was a route you use when you don't want a road. Ethan braced for the thing that always comes next in lesser stories and does not belong in this one, graphic loss paraded as proof. Frank spared everyone that poverty. They closed the exits, he said simply. Not with spectacle. With timing. Our point of egress was watched at the wrong hour by the right men. Carter understood before anyone said a word. He looked down at his hands like he was reading something only he could see. We got one message out. He sent it to his contact code-named Blackbird. The reply used a phrase Carter had deliberately miskeyed the day before to test the line. That's how he knew Blackbird was wrong. You don't make that mistake unless you've got your face against the glass from the other side. The apartment hummed with the small electricity of a refrigerator and the large electricity of finally saying aloud what a man has been carrying for 60 years. Naomi glanced at the window. Across the street, a sedan idled with the kind of patience that doesn't belong to errands. Ethan lowered his voice without thinking. Frank, after the war, what happened to Keene? Frank's mouth tightened. He got promoted. He became the story you tell when you need a door opened quickly. He learned to call betrayals, methods, and leaks, operations. When men like me tried to talk, we were old soldiers with memories and no paperwork you could read without a blessing. Ethan's phone rang with a number that belonged to no one. He let it go to speaker against his better judgment. A voice filled the room with the lack of hurry reserved for people who have never been denied an audience. Captain Carter, Thomas Keene. You'll bring all material to the federal building in Newark by 1400. This is not negotiable. Ethan looked at Frank, at Naomi, at the folder that had outlived so many rooms. Colonel, he said, keeping his tone even, we're in the middle of interviews corroborating events your office has chosen to call classified. Keene did not sigh. The air curved around him. I admire your zeal. I remind you that you are an officer with obligations. And I advise you to look out your window. Naomi moved without moving, peering through the curtain's edge. The sedan across the street turned its lights on for a single breath, then off. Frank didn't flinch. He did this in 1944, and he does it now, he said. Changes nothing except the calendar. Keene's voice sharpened, not loud, sharper, like a tool found in a drawer where it didn't belong. You are playing with mechanisms you don't understand, Captain. People can get lost in the woods for reasons other than weather. The line clicked dead, abrupt as a door. Silence returned like a presence with weight. Lila spoke first. We have enough to move, she said. We don't publish. We don't grandstand. We distribute to multiple repositories and parallel press outlets. If he's watching one door, we use 10. Frank gathered the papers with the care of someone lifting names, not documents. Tell your grandmother, he said gently, that her husband didn't get lost. Somebody tried to make the world forget he knew the way. Ethan stood, phone in one hand, the map's shadow in his head, the sedan's silhouette in his peripheral vision. He had wanted a neat answer that folded grief into ceremony. He had received a living adversary who still answered his own phone. He turned to Naomi. We can't go to them, he said. So we make them come to a table they don't control. Outside, the sedan pulled away without signaling, as if the street belonged to it by appointment. They left Newark before noon with the folder under Frank Hale's coat and the radio wrapped in a ranger station towel that still smelled faintly of pine cleaner. Naomi drove because she trusted the road more than Ethan trusted the silence. Dr. Lila Monroe stayed in D.C. to work the archives and the phones. The suits would file paperwork and call it cooperation. The sedan ghosted them for 20 blocks, then fell away when interstate logic made choice expensive. They took the Pulaski Skyway, cut north, and kept climbing until the highway lost its temper and became 2 lanes. Their destination was a Cold War communications annex outside Bangor, Maine, mothballed but not useless, a concrete idea forgotten by the people who build new ones. Inside, the place looked like a film had taken its costume budget and left. Dust made halos over racks that once hummed, old patch panels still labeled in pencil and hope. Power came back with a breaker that complained and then accepted the day. Naomi brought laptops onto old steel desks and pulled Ethernet like a magician produces scarves. Lila's face appeared on an encrypted call that made the room feel younger. I found the 1967 accession log, she said without preamble. 2 entries. One is a sealed annex to Michael Carter's personnel file. The second is a transfer note from an interagency review board listing Thomas Keene as a consulting authority. Different offices. Same pen. She looked off camera, then back. And Ethan, 3 journalists I contacted this morning have been detained for handling sensitive materials. It's coordinated. Frank didn't flinch. He had outlived coordination before. He opened his leather folder and produced something no one had asked for and everyone needed. Photocopies of ledger pages from a Swiss bank that had taught discretion to governments and priests. The name wasn't Keene's, not in ink. It was a shell corporation that had the good manners to change often. But numbers have accents, and these spoke American. Ernie Kellerman put this together, Frank said, voice low, steady. He was in our camp a week before Carter came down. He spent 10 years after the war tracking the money in rooms that didn't want him in them. He died in 2003. The gas company said it was a leak. The coroner said it wasn't suspicious. He slid a timeline across the desk like he was dealing cards no one wanted to win. Discrete payments from 1944 to 2001, spiking whenever Magpie sat near a switch labeled International Cooperation. Naomi began building a distribution tree. Not one outlet. Dozens. University investigative centers that don't live on federal grants. Regional papers that take insult personally. Veteran groups with newsletters that act like wire services when they must. She set transmission windows, mirrored servers, automatic releases tied to deadman timers no one would say aloud but everyone understood. Lila, mid-screen, coordinated legal advisors who cared more about truth than golf invitations. We don't publish inflammatory claims, she said. We publish documents. We publish the obstruction. We wake people up with paper, not fire. At dusk, Ethan dialed a Boston newsroom he trusted and got a voicemail that felt like a wall. He tried Seattle. A producer answered, whispered, then hung up so quickly he could hear the apology in the dial tone. Naomi's email pinged back with auto-replies that sounded the same, unavailable, reassigned, out of office indefinitely. The shape of the pressure was clear. If Keene couldn't own the story, he would starve it of air. Frank watched Ethan cross and recross the room between calls, a man measuring a cage by steps. You're doing what your grandfather did, Frank said gently. He chose a route no one controlled and made sure the message wasn't only his. Ethan nodded once and placed the compact transmitter on the desk like a relic and a reminder. He set his phone to record and called the number Keane had used, knowing it would go to a switchboard, knowing the act itself mattered. He introduced himself to the absence, stated the existence of documents, named the detention of journalists, and said the word obstruction 4 times in sentences that lawyers can love. The call returned not as a voice but as a presence on the pane of the annex's observation window. A black SUV idled in the gravel lot, doors shut, engine a steady implication. No one got out. No one had to. Naomi smiled without cheer. "Good," she said. "They're here for the show." She tilted the overhead camera toward the map and began a quiet narration of evidence, time stamps loud as gongs. Lila emailed 5 editors in Australia and 2 in New Zealand with full packets and a clause that made the release a foregone conclusion at 6 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time. Ethan phoned a reporter in Auckland who owed him nothing and offered him everything. The man asked 3 hard questions, then said yes in the tone people use when they decide which side of a line they want to live on. Keane finally called as the annex clock clicked past midnight, the sound of late decisions. "Captain Carter," he said, and the tired satin in his voice almost passed for civility. "You've mistaken complexity for corruption." Ethan kept the recorder visible in the webcam's corner, a small square of witness. "Then you won't mind clarifying on the record why interagency personnel detained reporters after we requested comment." Keane paused for half a breath. "National security isn't a toy." Ethan's grip tightened on the edge of the desk. "Neither is the truth." Naomi angled the camera and captured the brief reflection of the SUV lights shivering across Keane's pupils through the screen. It was small. It was enough. They sent the video to 12 outlets in 3 countries and a lawyer who had argued in front of judges who prioritized sunlight over protocol. The SUV in the lot blinked once and drove away without headlights until the turn. The annex hummed like obligation. Ethan leaned back and saw how the thread had held through 60 years of hands. His phone vibrated with a final text from a blocked number. "Enjoy your victory. Remember, some secrets outlive the people who open them." At 6 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time, the story didn't drop so much as arrive everywhere at once. University newsrooms in Wellington and Melbourne pushed the first files. Regional papers in the Midwest mirrored them before anyone could lean on a switch. The video of Thomas Keane, clipped from a midnight call and framed by the reflection of SUV lights, moved like a fax from another century, gray, steady, admitting nothing while revealing everything. The document spoke with the authority of ink, the 1967 accession log signed in the same hand for 2 agencies that shouldn't share a pen, the transfer orders bearing Keane's name, the ledger pages in neat Swiss arithmetic, the detention notices time-stamped within minutes of requests for comment. Evasion with a schedule reads like policy. Phones began to ring in places that preferred emails. A federal judge granted an emergency order to preserve all materials referenced in the release and barred destruction of related records, analog or digital. By noon, a grand jury in Virginia issued subpoenas. The SUV that had idled outside the Bangor Annex returned with different plates and no pretense, then left as state police cruisers pulled in nose-to-nose and asked for names that didn't belong to the weather. Keane tried one more narrative, necessary deception, legacy methods, youthful zeal, and watched it fold under the weight of his own reflection on camera. Frank Hale gave a statement from a chair that had been built for smaller truths. He wore his Signal Corps pin and spoke like he was paying a debt. He described the holding site in the Adirondacks, the quarantine frequency that kept reappearing in enemy traffic, the night a pilot reached them with a transmitter meant for windows, not crowds. Naomi Yazzi's field notes built a spine through the broadcast, each coordinate a vertebra, each chain of custody signature a rib. Dr. Lila Monroe stood in front of a glass wall at the National Archives and explained, without heat, what a sealed annex can do when a government lets it become a closet. By evening, resignations began, quiet, then televised. 2 consulting authorities, no one had voted for, left the stage with language that sounded like service and read like retreat. Keane was arrested in Arlington without theater, a man stepping through a door he thought only opened one way. The charge sheet didn't yell. It assembled. Conspiracy to obstruct, falsification of records, violations of classification statutes used as a shield for conduct unrelated to defense. When they walked him past a bank of cameras, he looked straight ahead the way men do who have practiced ignoring weather reports. The Defense Department certified the remains from 5 ponds with a speed that didn't feel like a favor so much as a correction. At Saratoga National Cemetery, the sky held its breath and the rifles did what ceremony asks. Ethan Carter accepted the folded flag without blinking, then let himself breathe as if the air needed permission. Naomi stood 1 row back, not because she belonged behind anyone, but because some work is witnessing. Lila arrived between flights and took the long way to the chairs, pausing at names she didn't know and still recognized. Frank sat with his hat in his lap, thumb moving along the brim, a small metronome measuring relief. After the funeral, the 3 of them walked past stones aligned like sentences that end in periods, not question marks. Ethan's phone vibrated with an email that didn't feel like routine, an invitation from a newly chartered oversight body to lead a review of historical cases where secrecy and convenience had traded places. He didn't answer on the path. He looked at the flag, at the old transmitter in a display box, at Frank's hands steady at last. Keene's arraignment date populated the news ticker. The list of cooperating witnesses grew a line at a time. The story wasn't over. It had simply learned to stand up in daylight. That night, back at the annex, they opened one last envelope postmarked from nowhere, the sort of thing you recognize by its caution. Inside was a photocopy of a travel voucher from 1944 bearing a surname never used in public and a set of initials that tied to the shell company on the Swiss bank pages. Not a confession. A leak in the dam. Lila photographed it, cataloged it, and sent it to the same distributed network that had made the morning work. Frank laughed once, quietly, not because it was funny but because a weight had shifted to where the floor could take it. Ethan wrote to his grandmother as if she could still check the mailbox. He didn't get lost. He knew a route no one else controlled, and when they closed it, he found another way to be heard. When he hit send, the annex hummed like a machine that had been waiting for a human reason. What the case taught, in the simplest terms, is small enough to carry. Secrecy can protect lives or it can protect convenience. It never does both for long. Paper outlasts threat. So does witness. Families deserve more than clean sentences written over untidy facts, and truth, when it is finally given a path, doesn't need to shout. It just needs not to be stopped.